This is East Asia Tonight.
Good evening, I'm Otelli Edwards. Tonight's top stories. Thousands evacuated in Taiwan as a severe tropical storm dumps heavy rain on the island's mountainous east coast ahead of its expected landfall tomorrow. Climate talks at COP30 in Brazil open with urgent calls for unity and faster action. As a report says, planet-warming greenhouse emissions from China have held steady for 18 months in a row. Beijing says it's ready to restart talks and cooperation with Canada after a phone call between the two foreign ministers following last month's Xi-Kani meeting at APEC in South Korea. And anti-dumping investigations against China spreading worldwide as countries protect domestic industries from low-cost Chinese imports. Ahead on the bulletin, their electronic eyes watch over our planet from space, tracking floods, fires and forests. But could satellites themselves be changing the Earth's atmosphere? Also in space, China's manned space agency saying it's making steady progress to bring back a Shenzhou 20 crew after their return capsule was reportedly struck by space debris. Severe tropical storm Fung-wong is headed towards Taiwan and could potentially bring heavy rains to China's Fujian province. Now, the storm was previously a super typhoon as it made landfall in the Philippines Sunday evening and killing at least 18 people. It lost intensity after barreling through the archipelago. Fung-wong, combined with effects of the northeast monsoon, is already bringing torrential rains to Taiwan well ahead of its predicted landfall tomorrow on the island's southwestern coast. Authorities have issued a land warning today and evacuated more than 3,000 people. Coastal Hualien has already been seen flooding in an area where 18 people were killed by an earlier typhoon in September. Further north, Yilan also seeing water levels in some low-lying areas rising. Residents are bracing for the storm. Well, China is not in the storm's direct path. Coastal provinces are taking precautions. Fishing boats have been recalled to port for safety, with personnel being evacuated to shore. Guangdong has also activated the lowest of a 4-tier emergency response as authorities eye the impact of Fung-wong. Well, the storm is currently passing through the South China Sea, some 300 kilometers away from Taiwan's Kaohsiung, packing wind gusts of up to 137 kilometers per hour. For more, CNA's Victoria Jen joins us live from Taipei. Vic, so tell us about the latest on Tropical Storm Fung-wong and also the situation in Hualien.
Yes, Fung-wong has now been downgraded to a tropical storm, but is still bringing strong winds and heavy rain to eastern Taiwan. Now, the worst conditions so far are in Hualien County, where more than 3,000 residents have been evacuated. The biggest worry there is the Mataian Creek Barrier Lake in Guangfu Township. That's the same spot that gave way during Typhoon Ragasa, killing more than a dozen people and destroying homes. Now this time, authorities move early, setting up sensors to monitor water levels and sending rescue teams to the area before the rain intensified. The Weather Bureau warns that the storm's outer rain bands will continue to drench the east through Wednesday after making landfall. Even though it's weaker, its wide rain field could still trigger landslides, debris flows, and flash floods, especially in Hualien's rugged terrain. Now, here in the north, conditions remain mild, light rain and steady winds, but Hualien's experience is already shaping how the rest of the island prepares for what's ahead.
So, Vic, the government, how are they responding, especially after what we had seen with earlier storms this year?
Well, the government has clearly learned of mistakes from Typhoon Ragaza, the deadliest typhoon in recent years. During that storm, warnings were delayed and communications was patchy. This time, early action has been the priority. Evacuation orders went out well before heavy rains arrived in Hualien, and emergency shelters were opened, and updates are now broadcast simultaneously on TV, radio, and mobile alerts to avoid confusion. National and local disaster centers are on full alert, deploying crews to check floodgates, clear drains, and secure slopes along highways and rivers. Elsewhere, Taoyuan, Yilan, and Hualien have all closed their schools and offices as a precaution. Taipei remains open for now, but residents are being urged to secure outdoor items and stay off mountain roads once the storm peaks. Officials say the focus now is on prevention rather than reaction, making sure that when the rain hits hardest, people are already safe.
Well, many thanks for that report. Victoria Jen reporting to us live from Taipei. Now, over in the Philippines, rescuers are assessing the damage after the storm triggered floods and landslides, knocking out power to entire provinces. Now, more than 1 million people were forced to evacuate ahead of Fung-wong's landfall as a super typhoon on Sunday night. It is the 21st typhoon to hit the country, which is still reeling from last week's Typhoon Kalmagi. Kalmagi killed more than 200 people. Climate talks at the COP30 summit in Brazil have begun with a call for faster action and for countries to get along. The UN climate chief said fracturing international consensus is threatening efforts to limit global warming.
But friends, let me be clear. In this arena of COP30, your job here is not to fight one another. Your job here is to fight this climate crisis together. Paris is working to deliver real progress. Let's not forget that.
He was speaking to delegates from more than 190 countries. The US is absent from the gathering. And the world's largest historical emitter of greenhouse gases has opted to skip this year's summit. President Donald Trump has labeled climate science as a con job.
I think that the absence of the U.S., some reluctance and complexity in the way that some other developed countries are dealing with climate have opened some space for the world to see what developing countries are doing.
Leaders of the UN climate talks have pushed for more efforts to curb global warming by reducing carbon pollution that causes it. A new UN analysis of countries' emissions cutting plans estimated that global greenhouse gases would drop by 12% by 2035 from 2019 levels. This is an improvement from an earlier estimate of 10% published last month. Meantime, China's carbon dioxide emissions were found to be flat on year in the third quarter. That means the world's biggest polluter has seen either unchanged or falling CO2 emissions for the past 18 months. Well, this is according to UK-based climate news specialist Carbon Brief, analysing official Chinese data. Emissions from China's power sector, which is the most dominant source of CO2, was steady in the third quarter, despite strong electricity demand. A surge in green energy sources could have played a part amid a fall in emissions from transport fuel, cement and steel production. The flat emissions trend started in March last year, raising hopes that China could see a drop in the full-year total in CO2 released. Well, China in September announced its commitment to reduce economy-wide emissions from peak levels by 2035. The South Korean government has approved a new and higher emission reduction target. The country now seeks to cut greenhouse gas emissions by 53 to 61% from 2018 levels in the next decade. Seoul will officially announce the plan at COP30 in Beijing. President Lee Jae-myung has called his country's transition to a carbon-neutral society inevitable for sustainable growth. And that's amid plans to expand the use of renewable energy sources, including solar and wind power. His comments echo remarks made by Prime Minister Kim Min-sok, who said that the latest cut seeks to boost South Korea's industrial competitiveness. Well, these targets, also known as a nationally determined contribution, or NDC, have to be submitted every 5 years to the UN under the Paris Agreement. While Japan did not announce anything this week, Tokyo approved new targets in February. The country aims to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 60% from 2013 levels by 2035. And for more insights into the U.S. withdrawal from climate action and whether China could fill its shoes, we'll be chatting with Belinda Schape, China policy analyst at the Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air. Coming up next on East Asia tonight, Japan's new leader identifies 17 areas for investment to revitalize the economy. And Japan's SoftBank Group says it has sold all its Nvidia shares as it reports net profit more than doubled in the second quarter. Hello there, if you've just joined us, welcome to East Asia Tonight, and it is now time for your business news with Roland Lim. Roland, Japan's Prime Minister launching this apparently huge plan to revitalize the economy?
You heard right, Yoteli. Yeah, it's a big stimulus and investments in key industries to make Japan great again. Japan's new Prime Minister, Sanae Takaichi, is looking to revitalize the economy by investing in 17 areas, including chips and ships. And that's in line with a multi-trillion yen stimulus package the government is expected to announce this month. The Prime Minister has assembled a Growth Strategy Council. The sectors identified for investment include artificial intelligence and semiconductors, shipbuilding, critical minerals, and defense. Ms. Takaichi has signaled a shift towards greater government spending. She also renewed calls for the Bank of Japan to go slow on interest rate hikes, urging the central bank to achieve a stable inflation driven by stronger wages, not by higher costs. Economic growth is a top priority for Ms. Takaichi. Public anger over inflation led to a string of electoral defeats by the long-ruling Liberal Democratic Party. The price of rice, for instance, a staple in Japanese diets, has doubled since 2023. Japan's SoftBank Group reported that its second quarter net profit more than doubled to $16.6 billion, far outrunning the average analyst estimate of $2.7 billion. The bulk of the gains coming from its holdings in ChatGPT creator OpenAI. In a surprise move, SoftBank also said it sold its entire stake in NVIDIA last month, pocketing the group more than $5.8 billion. Now, SoftBank is reportedly looking to shore up finances ahead of a spending spree by founder Masayoshi Son. Earlier in June, he pitched a $1 trillion robotics and AI industrial complex in the US. Shares of SoftBank ending the day up nearly 2%, having climbed nearly 150% year to date. Meantime, Sony is raising its profit forecast after delivering an earnings beat for the quarter, lifted by strong performances in its music and imaging divisions. It's also announced a share buyback worth some $648 million. Revenue came in at $21 billion, or up 8% on year. Adjusted net income was $2.1 billion, a figure that's roughly 7% down on year, as it booked impairment losses related to Destiny 2 video game, though its operating profit did rise 10% on year. Its imaging business jumped nearly 50%, Sony's top earner this quarter, while music profits, well, that climbed 28%. Now, Sony's picture business slumped 25% despite the global streaming hit K-pop Demon Hunters, produced by Sony but sold to Netflix. A sequel is now in the works, with Netflix reportedly rewarding Sony with a $15 million bonus. The stock closed the session more than 5% up before the release of the results. Burger King China is looking to rapidly expand. It wants to more than double its store count within the next 10 years. And to do that, the parent company of the American fast food chain will form a joint venture with Chinese private equity firm CPE. Restaurant Brands International says CPE will invest $350 million to command an 83% stake in the joint venture, with RBI retaining the rest and a seat on the board. Earlier in February, RBI bought out Burger King China and said that it was looking for a local partner. It's part of a trend of American chain restaurants seeking local collaborators in China as the country's consumption slows. While China is the largest market for RBI, average restaurant sales in the country are the company's lowest. It's that time of the year again. November 11 marks Singles' Day, the world's biggest shopping event, a flash sale binge that originated in China. But sales have already begun last month as the event has grown into a weeks-long online shopping festival in recent years. It's also part of efforts by Chinese retailers to boost spending in a sluggish market. The country's consumers have been cutting back on spending amid economic pressures from youth unemployment, a prolonged property crisis, steep government debt, and the ongoing trade war with the US. The Chinese government has been spending billions to try to boost spending, but retail sales growth has remained sluggish. Now, September's intake was at a one-year low. But there are signs that demand is recovering. Deflation pressures in China eased last month, and consumer prices returned to growth after months in negative territory. Beijing's efforts at reining in price wars and fueling demand seems to have started to bear fruit. A Singles' Day was said to have begun in the early 90s in the dorm rooms of Chinese university, when a group of single friends decided to mark the day as a cheeky way to counter Valentine's Day. It soon became the unofficial day for Chinese youths to celebrate or at least feel okay about being single. Then in 2009, Alibaba's Jack Ma saw an opportunity, retail therapy to soothe those lonely hearts. The Chinese e-commerce giant is taking a different approach this year as it taps into AI to help shoppers navigate its sites. Now, today, the holiday generates $150 billion in annual sales, and that's more than Black Friday and Amazon Prime Day combined. Greater China markets struggled to maintain positive momentum like the rest of Asia. Shanghai Composite closing out the day 0.4 in the red. Second Bourse Shenzhen component down by more than 1%. Hang Seng Index, though, managed to hover around one-year highs, offset by declines in tech stocks. A Chinese electric vehicle maker XPeng surged for a second straight day on optimism after it launched robotaxis and humanoid robots with self-developed AI chips last week. And the Singles' Day shopping event is underway, but investors aren't snapping up. E-commerce stocks, Alibaba down 1.8% for the day. JD.com, its rival, also 1% in the red. Over the past few years, Vietnam has become a key gateway for Chinese companies exporting to the US. Relocating to the Southeast Asian nation used to allow them to sidestep steep tariffs imposed by Washington amid the US-China trade war. But the new transshipment penalties have diminished Vietnam's appeal. CNA's Amir Yusuf speaks to Chinese businesses that moved their operations to the country, only to be hit by the latest wave of duties.
Hua Shaw's Plastics hails from Guangdong in southeastern China. The firm produces plastic boards to make delivery boxes for companies such as Amazon. 90% of its products are exported to the United States. A few years ago, it moved some operations to Vietnam's northeastern city of Haiphong. It was among Chinese firms adopting the China Plus One strategy to avoid US tariffs by diversifying supply chains. But in August, Washington imposed a 20% tariff on imports from Vietnam. Separately, Washington also has a 40% levy on goods from China transiting through third countries. The transshipment levy is seen as US President Donald Trump's move to force Vietnam and other Southeast Asian countries to reduce Chinese content in their supply chains. Hua Shaw's orders have since slowed.
之前在没有这个关税之前，我们生产的比较顺，交货都很顺。我们确实在减少一些人员，减少我们的整个成本。因为下降比较快嘛，下降比较快，我们要做出反应，就是人员一定要减少。 占了1/3。
Even Chinese firms that do not supply to the US are affected. BYD Forklift, a subsidiary of the Chinese automaker, moved to Vietnam's leading industrial center Bắc Ninh last year. It supplies material handling equipment for the local Vietnamese market. But with many of its business partners hit by tariffs and cutting orders, BYD Forklift was also forced to downsize operations.
本来是有一些企业是需要这个叉车的，因为它用途量还是比较大，但是说这个关税下来以后呢，会卡了它一下，就说卡脖子嘛，对不对？它订单量会小，然后呢，它这个需求的一些搬运设备呢就会停滞或者说延期。
Some Chinese companies are considering moving operations elsewhere. A study by the United Nations Development Programme says the tariffs could slash Vietnam's exports to the US by 1/5, making it the worst hit in Southeast Asia. Still, analysts say the country has an edge, as it has a large land border with China and several deep-water ports. But they warn that uncertainty over Trump's policies is the biggest factor that could drive businesses away.
A wait-and-see approach has started basically maybe back in September, October of 2024, and it's continued up to this point. I mean, if you're an American company, Canadian company, European company, but especially if you have any ties to the American market at all, it would not make a lot of sense to come to Vietnam, but also other countries in the region, because people don't have a strong understanding of where those numbers are going to land.
希望这个东西呢，我们也不好说，因为美国的话，这个特朗普他是有个霸权主义吧。我想怎么搞，他一句话的事情，对吧？他这个霸权主义嘛，这是一方面，我们是左右不了他的想法。
Like Huashuo and BYD, many Chinese firms in Vietnam feel that they are in limbo, telling CNA that the only certainty to be expected is more uncertainty. Amir Yuso, CNA, Hanoi.
Investigations into low-priced Chinese exports are gaining momentum across the globe, with emerging economies joining the U.S. in targeting key sectors. Data from the World Trade Organization, or WTO, show that in the first half of this year, 79 anti-dumping and countervailing duty probes targeting Chinese goods were launched. And that's more than triple the number the same period 3 years ago. The U.S. led the charge in the first 6 months of 2025, launching 21 investigations. India followed with 10. Other major economies, such as Brazil and Mexico, have also stepped up scrutiny. Analysts say the trend reflects a growing pushback against China's excess production and could spark a new trade friction. Under WTO rules, countries are allowed to impose anti-dumping duties if foreign goods are sold below market value. Despite weak domestic demand from its slowing property sector, Chinese factories continue to churn out goods at high volumes. To address overcapacity, Chinese authorities have ordered sectors such as electric vehicles and steel to limit price cuts, output, and investment. And that'll do it for business. Oteli.
Thanks so very much for that, Roland. Well, we are going to go for a short break now, but coming up on East Asia tonight, the COP30 climate conference opens in Brazil with calls for urgency and unity. But there is no high-level delegation from the US. From the Amazon to orbit, new space tools are transforming how we tackle climate change. But could they also be quietly warming the planet? This is East Asia Tonight, and here are the headlines we're following. Anti-dumping investigations against China spreading worldwide, with emerging economies joining the U.S. in targeting key sectors as countries protect domestic industries from low-cost Chinese imports. Thousands evacuated in Taiwan as a severe tropical storm dumps heavy rain on the island's mountainous east coast ahead of its expected landfall tomorrow. And climate talks at COP30 in Brazil open amid calls for unity and faster action, with the UN chief warning that fracturing international consensus is threatening efforts to limit global warming. The event marked by the absence of top US representation. And for more analysis on COP30, we're joined now by Belinda Schape. She's China policy analyst from the Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air. Thanks for joining us today, Belinda. First up, I thought I'd just get a quick reaction from you to China's greenhouse emission report, which has held steady 18 months in a row now. But in terms of China's latest climate pledges as a whole, some critics say it's falling short of what's needed at COP30. What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, so it's a big moment that China's emissions seem to be leveling off. They haven't increased since March last year, and that indicates that China might be peaking emissions soon. And that's really important because China has contributed around 90% of the emissions growth over the last decade. So this year, China has put forward climate targets for 2035, so over the next decade, to reduce emissions by 7 to 10% compared to a peak. But unfortunately, that's not quite aligned with what we would need for the Paris Agreement, which would be much closer to 30% emission reductions compared to current levels. So you can see there's quite a divergence there. And also the sectoral targets that China has set for renewables, for example, would mean a dramatic slowdown from the build-out that we're seeing at the moment. But I would say the good news is that we recently conducted a survey with leading Chinese experts on this, and the majority believe that China can overachieve these targets that it can set. So we're very much hoping to see that, and we're also hoping for more clarification in China's upcoming 15th five-year plan to lay out what the country's trajectory will look like over the next 5 years for renewables, but especially also for phasing down coal.
So in the meantime, I mean, it's very clear that Washington has taken a back seat on climate action for now. So China, do you think that, they're able to step up and fill that global climate leadership that's been left void under the U.S. Trump?
Yeah, the US withdrawal from the global climate agenda has created a lot of uncertainty. And it's also taken out the pressure for countries to step up their ambition for mitigation and also climate finance. China has very much positioned itself in contrast to that as a more stabilizing power, as a major responsible power, and President Xi has termed the green transition as the trend of our time that the global community should stay committed to. But China is certainly not trying to replace the US in the same way as a Western-style climate leader. So far, it's very much framing its contribution to climate change through its role as a clean tech power and clean tech provider for the rest of the world, in a way enabling the green transition around the world. And as I mentioned, China's domestic climate targets are still quite far off and not really putting itself into a leadership role. So I think there is a void for China to step into, but we have yet to see the country to really confidently stride into it.
Okay, so China not quite ready to play that leadership role. I want to talk about the investment gap and pick up on a study by the World Resources Institute. And they found that every dollar invested in adaptation actually brings more than $10 in long-term benefits, for instance. So help us understand is why we're still seeing such a huge funding gap and what's holding governments and investors back.
One of the big challenges is the US withdrawal, because that came also with the stop of a lot of international climate finance. And then there are a lot of traditional Western donors that are struggling with their own domestic financial situations, trying to mobilize that money. So that will be a key discussion at this climate conference in Brazil this year, to think through how that money can be mobilized towards the 1.3 trillion in climate finance that is needed, and at least the 300 billion that developed countries committed to. But as you mentioned, adaptation, the challenge is for clean energy projects, there's a lot more returns. For adaptation, the returns are a bit more indirect and for the countries that are impacted. So another key target for the negotiations in this week and next week is to find agreement on finding a common goal for adaptation finance going forward. And hopefully there will also be other non-traditional donors that can step into that role. Because as I said, the US is out of the picture. Western governments seem really strapped. So it's really about thinking through other innovative sources on how that finance gap can be filled.
Also on global carbon trading rules, I believe China is now joining a Brazil-led coalition to link carbon markets. It's one of COP30's key proposals. How significant is that partnership?
Yeah, so Brazil's proposal aims to kind of create a common standard for the monitoring, reporting, and verification of carbon markets. And we have around 40 carbon markets already around the world at the moment, but currently they're not compatible. So it's really important to drive this agenda forward. China has been pushing for this for a while, and there's been some more urgency after the EU announced its own measure on this, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. That one basically puts a levy on imports, on emission-intensive imports from other countries to kind of combat or like to create a level playing field for domestic producers that have to pay a carbon price. But this is not China's preferred way of going forward. So there seems to be some good momentum on this at COP30, but it is a tricky process and it requires a lot of technical discussions on how these carbon markets can be linked. So I hope we see progress this year, but it may not be just the final discussion on this topic just yet.
And Belinda, I just want to zoom in on the region, and that's East Asia. We've seen rapid data center growth powering the region because of digital future, but also consuming huge amounts of energy, much of it from fossil fuels. How serious is the climate impact of this trend?
There's been a lot of attention to the role of data centers and AI electricity demand, but I do want to say that a lot of that is dramatically overestimated. When we look into the Chinese case, where data centers are growing rapidly, their electricity consumption is expected to double over the next 2 years. That sounds like a lot, but it's doubling from a very small share. Over the last 3 years, it contributed for only 3% of the additional demand of electricity. So not electricity overall, but just the increasing demand. And on top of that, we're seeing a lot of efficiency gains as the technology develops and as we see more research and innovation in this. So I would say for now and for some future to come, traditional industries still hold a much, much higher share in both electricity consumption and energy consumption, and with that also emissions. So I think we should still focus on traditional industries and how to decarbonize them going forward.
Hey, thanks so much for making that clarification and unpacking COP30's climate strategy. Belinda Schape, she's China Policy Analyst, Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air. Now, part of the conversation at COP30 is about using new tools to understand our changing planet. From tracking floods to monitoring deforestation, space-based Earth observation, or EO, is transforming how we tackle the climate crisis. But at the same time, these very tools could be quietly affecting the atmosphere they monitor. CNA's Julie Yu explains.
When we talk about climate change, we usually focus on what's happening down here, the hurricanes, wildfires, droughts, and flooding. But the story of our warming planet is also unfolding above us in space, thanks to our revolution in satellite and sensor technology, giving us a whole new view of Earth. At the heart of this revolution is Earth observation, or EO, a vast network of satellites watching over our land, oceans, and atmosphere. And with AI, machine learning, and advanced cameras, all that data is now being turned into predictions, alerts, and real-time insights that can help us act faster. Right now, more than 9,000 satellites orbit the Earth, tracking weather, guiding navigation, enabling communication, and monitoring our environment. And by 2040, that number could balloon to 60,000. Take NISAR, a U.S.-India radar mission launched in July. It will track centimeter-scale ground change, everything from glacier retreat in the Himalayas to potential landslide zones in South America. The biomass satellite, launched in April by the European Space Agency, uses special radar to measure how much carbon is stored in the world's forests. That helps countries check whether they're truly gaining or losing forest cover. And satellites such as MethaneSat are spotting invisible methane leaks across oil fields, right down to individual facilities, giving regulators and companies nowhere to hide. While satellites help us fight climate change, they might also be quietly adding to it. Researchers estimate that by 2040, about 10,000 tons of aluminium oxide could enter the upper atmosphere each year from roughly 3,000 deorbiting satellites. When they reach the end of their lifespan, which is about 5 years, they're guided back into the atmosphere where they burn up, releasing aluminium and other metals. That debris doesn't disappear, it builds up, especially over high latitudes, where scientists say it could raise temperatures by up to 1.5 degrees Celsius, disrupt wind patterns, and slow ozone recovery. So the link between space and climate runs both ways. Now, EO can help us understand and protect our planet, but how we manage space will shape our climate's future. Cleaner, smarter, and more open. That's how space tech can stay part of the climate solution.
And of course, we've got more climate-related coverage across CNA platforms, including on our website, cna.asia, and our mobile app, including this piece on how American climate activists are seen to be shifting from mass demonstrations to targeted campaigns aimed at everyday concerns, such as jobs and energy costs. Coming up on East Asia tonight, a new connecting flight between India and China takes off after 5 years. We speak to the CEO of IndiGo on what this route means for business, travel and trade. And China says it's making steady progress to ensure the safe return of the Shenzhou 20 crew after its capsule was reportedly struck by space junk. Japan is seeking to strengthen its defense sector and boost exports. It outlined plans at an annual defense symposium, the first since hawkish Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi took office. Well, the leader's latest remarks calling an attack on Taiwan a possible risk to Japan's existence, causing friction with China. CNA senior correspondent Michio Ishida has more.
Defense officials, researchers, and academics were among those who took part in Japan's Defense Technology Symposium, a government-led event that has been held for more than 60 years. Defense Minister Shinjiro Koizumi gave the opening remarks.
自民党と日本維新の会との間で5類型の撤廃が合意されたことも踏まえ、防衛装備移転三原則の運用指針の見直しを早期に実現すべく、関係省庁と連携しながら検討を進めてまいります。
Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi has positioned the defense industry as part of Japan's growth strategy. She aims to move up the target for increasing defense spending to 2% of GDP by 2 years and revise key national defense documents. Officials are also pushing to develop domestic defense technology and expand exports. This includes technologies such as artificial intelligence for use in unmanned aircraft. Japan has long relied on imports of defense equipment from its ally, the U.S., with some observers seeing domestic development as going against Japan's pacifist constitution. But this is changing with increase in research and development picking up in the private sector and educational institutes.
先進的な基礎研究に対します支援を続け、今年度は制度を創設以来、最多となります340件の応募をいただき、特に大学等からは前年度比で約3倍となる123件の応募をいただきました。
This comes as the domestic defense industry is being seen as a way for Japan to both strengthen its security capabilities and drive economic growth. The symposium takes place till Wednesday. Michio Ishida, CNA, Tokyo.
China says that it's ready to resume exchanges and cooperation with Canada. That's after a phone call between the two countries' foreign ministers. China's state news agency Xinhua reports that China's Wang Yi told his Canadian counterpart Anita Anand that Beijing wants to strengthen communication with Ottawa. He said diplomatic, commercial and other departments from both sides could work more closely to address their respective concerns and restore coordination. Their conversation follows a meeting last month between Chinese President Xi Jinping and Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney on the sidelines of the APEC summit in South Korea. The two leaders discussed trade issues from agriculture to electric vehicles, signaling a cautious thaw after years of strained relations. Now, ties between the two countries had sharply deteriorated after the 2018 arrest of a Chinese telecom executive in Vancouver and China's detention of two Canadians in response. Trade tensions had also deepened with Ottawa imposing new tariffs on Chinese steel and Beijing retaliating with steep duties on Canadian canola. A Delhi-Guangzhou flight by IndiGo touched down at Baiyun Airport early this morning, marking the second direct flight route between China and India after a 5-year suspension. IndiGo CEO Peter Ibis was on this morning's flight, and he told CNA's Yasmin Yonkers the new services go beyond just a route.
I think it speaks for the agility of IndiGo and the sort of preparedness for it. So whenever the two governments basically announced the restart or the reopening, I would say, of the airspace and the corridor between the two countries, we worked relentlessly, and I'm very proud on the IndiGo team who did all the preparations to get this up and running. And prior to COVID, IndiGo was operating out of Kolkata into Guangzhou, but this is really new, and it's more than just it's a route. It's part of the internationalization strategy, and looking at the fact that 1/3 of the world population is living in these two countries. The fact that we start now these flights is an incredible important moment for us. So therefore, the drums and the dance at the airport was, I would say, very appropriate.
Okay. Well, are you expecting this brand new Delhi-Guangzhou route to be driven primarily by business travelers, students, or leisure traffic? And then how do you approach pricing in that case, and also capacity to balance these segments profitably?
Well, I would almost say all of the above. IndiGo typically is targeting all the different market segments, and clearly with tourism between India and China still at the very nascent stage. There's a lot of business and trade and I would say commercial relationships between the two. But as the borders will open and as visas will start to flow, the opportunity to further build on that and address the multiple market segments, not only the commercial ones, but indeed perhaps also students and other forms of collaboration and connections between the two countries. I think IndiGo has a price point and very much I would say the core of IndiGo, offering affordable fares that resonates extremely well. And today morning at the airport, I was talking to a group of Indian customers here in Guangzhou itself, and they were so excited and sort of grateful for the opportunity which is there.
All right, and we know that Guangzhou is also a key commercial hub. Are there then plans to expand cargo capabilities alongside these passenger services of yours?
Yeah, we already have a cargo flight operating that started actually some while back already. But now clearly with not only full cargo flights, but also having some cargo space in the bellies, I think we start to establish that link as well. And as I said, this is the start of a longer journey. So the opportunities both on the passenger and the cargo side are really there.
Okay, that's good to know. And looking ahead then, how do you see India-China air connectivity evolving? Do you have more destinations on the cards? And what challenges or the policy factors could influence your expansion plans?
Yeah, well, clearly we have the ambition to grow. And I mean, there's numerous cities, both in India and China, with 5 million plus population. So direct connectivities between these two cities is really, I would say, a great opportunity. IndiGo will start to get the XLR by the end of this year and more in the years ahead. The Airbus 321 XLR is typically an aircraft which you could use for these, I would say, thinner routes between these cities. So the opportunity to start building on that clearly is there. Today we started Guangzhou, and obviously we're looking to other Chinese cities as well.
Well, there's lots of pent-up demand, like you say, but how do you make, the seats full as time goes by? How do you make this a sustainable thing?
I think there's a couple of factors. First of all, both countries are having a growing economic ties in terms of trade and relationships. That was being suspended a lot around the COVID area, and as things are moving forward, I think the two governments have taken steps to enhance that commercial relationship between the two countries. Clearly, that will stimulate demand. And again, looking at the fact that today 1/3 of the world population is living in these two countries, And with the exception of flights to Hong Kong, there was no direct connectivity between India and China. So, even if that double daily flight we have today would multiply a couple of times, then still looking at the population sizes and the economic size of the two countries, China being the second largest economy in the world and India being the fourth largest economy in the world, the fact that the opportunity for direct flight now is there would just stimulate demand and would create a lot of new relationship between the two nations.
And we know that China's got these slot constraints and also deferring aviation regulations. So is IndiGo then exploring partnerships or inter-airline arrangements with particularly Chinese carriers or travel partners there to deepen your market access?
Yeah, thank you for addressing that. Actually, we've signed up today for a commercial partnership with China Southern. China Southern clearly having a very strong position here in Guangzhou itself, but also Beijing, but primarily here in Guangzhou. So we have announced here the partnership, which will allow customers from IndiGo to connect on that huge network of China Southern, both in India itself as well as beyond to other parts of the world, and vice versa. Whenever China Southern were to decide to start flying into India, we will have a similar arrangement there. And I think when it comes to partnerships, it's all pretty new for IndiGo, but over the past 3 years, we've really stepped up the game when it comes to partnerships, and we've seen actually very, very positive momentum on that, and hence flying to Guangzhou and then connecting up with China Southern is the very logic thing to do. And for China Southern, flying to India and connecting up with IndiGo being the largest operator of India makes a lot of sense for them as well.
Now, China says that efforts to bring home its Shenzhou 20 astronaut crew are proceeding as planned in an orderly manner. It's the first such update from the authorities since their trip back to Earth was postponed, after their return capsule was suspected to have been struck by space debris. A return date has yet to be announced. While the severity of the debris impact remains unclear, the China Manned Space Agency said that emergency plans kicked in with a slew of analysis, testing and safety assessment conducted for the updated return plan. Agency officials added that the Tiangong space station is operating normally and can well support 2 crews in orbit. For now, the Shenzhou 20 crew is helping the Shenzhou 21 members with their scientific experiments. And thanks for accompanying on East Asia tonight. Don't forget your headlines anytime at cna.asia. And as and when, you can always look us up on Facebook and YouTube. Thanks so much for your company. Good night.